Brilliant. Thank you for joining us for the 11th panel session of the IIEA webinar series. I can see from the list, it's so nice to see so many friends and colleagues from around the world joining us. Today's panel session is on revolutions, theory and evidence. Just as a reminder, we will be followed by a Q&A, so please make sure to use the chat function. Don't put it, sorry, not the chat function, the Q&A function, and put your questions in there, and our panelists can answer your questions. So that would be wonderful. And in case you have any suggestions for future topics and speakers, please do send me an email. Without further ado, let me pass over to our IIEA's very, very own Nadereh Chamlou, and very much looking forward to the session.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm delighted and honored to chair this, to moderate this session, which is not only very exciting, that has a very exciting topic, but also is very timely for the time that we find ourselves in, both in Iran as well as in some other countries. I am Nadereh Chamlou, as Kamia Jan just explained. I have had the pleasure and the honor of being a board member of the IIEA for quite a few years, and I'm also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council working on Iran and the Middle East and North Africa region. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing and moderating this session with two excellent experts on this topic. Let me begin with Professor Thomas Apolte, who is a professor of political economy at the University of Münster in Germany. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Duisburg in Germany. From 2000 to 2010, he was also professor of economics and public policy at the University of Münster, where he has been a professor of political economy since then. He has held visiting positions at Brigham Young University, at the University of Texas in the United States, the Center for Study of Public Choice at George Mason University here close by in Fairfax, Virginia, where I'm today, and at West Virginia University in Morgantown, West Virginia. He has also taught at universities in Poland and elsewhere. His research interests are in the field of political economy, public choice, and comparative economics. In particular, the political economy of democracy and autocracy, peace and conflict economics, the political economy of revolutions, and populism. Among others, he has also written 4 important books, as well as articles in journals about some of the journals are the Journal for Comparative Economics, Public Choice, European Journal of Political Economy, Economics of Transition, and Defense and Peace Economics. With that, I would like to ask you to join me in welcoming Professor Apolte and his very, very interesting and intuitive approach to this topic. And with that, I would like to welcome you to start your presentation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for the nice introduction. I will try to share my presentation. Actually, that's working. Usually it does. Here we go. Can you see the presentation already? No. You don't see the presentation, do you?
No, no. It was.
Let me see. Well, I've done quite a bit of on Zoom, but today there's some sort of Let me see. That should do.
I have your presentation. I can share it, but okay, you have it.
Perfect.
Here we go. That should do. Sorry for prompt. How much time do I have at all?
About 20 minutes. Is that
20
would
minutes,
that
fine.
be good?
Yeah. Okay. So let me get started. So we choose the type challenging revolution narrative, and so that be what's the revolution narrative? It's one would say it's a very brief and very naive, so to speak, chain of causality, which runs, it starts from assuming an unjust autocratic regime of sort with oppression, exploitation, discontent, and all that. And the chain of causality goes as follows. All this provokes public unrest, and given that we have public unrest, this induced regime collapse, and further on leads new and more just social contracts among the inhabitants of a certain country, possibly a democratic regime. Well, if you look at the pieces of causality, so to speak, then in the last step we have something that is just exists just by assumption, because what it implies is that whenever an unjust regime collapses, there will be a better one, and this is an assumption that needs to be questioned. And then there is a shortcut from the public, from public unrest to a regime collapse, because it's not straightforward that we have public unrest in a certain country, then regime indeed collapse, and we have seen many cases in the last 4 or 5 years all around the world, including Iran, where there have been intense public protests, but no regime collapses. Was also the case in Belarus, it was in Venezuela, and in many other countries. This is indeed a shortcut empirically, and I will show in a minute that this applies also to any theoretical reasoning. And then there's another shortcut from the assumption of, or the starting point of an unjust regime to public unrest, because that might happen, but it's not always the case. The most prominent writer, so to speak, came up with such a shortcut would be Marx, and he's very, or he would be, he's still very popular for feuilleton writers, at least in Germany. And so, you might forgive that remark here. And then, but there are also very famous scholars, economists, and game theorists like Acemoglu and Robinson that all the time we use that shortcut and do not go into the details, problems that's behind that piece of causality that we have here. And what I want to do here is to, well, so to speak, to deconstruct that naive chain of causality and point to the many problems that are behind that. And I must say, I'm a theorist, and I do that perfectly on the basis of theoretical considerations, and not by evaluating probabilities and empirical results and all that stuff. So this is my point of departure. It says that an autocratic regime acts in some sort of an evil way, and in doing so, it is observed by the population. So what would come next? This is the question. Well, there are 3 questions associated with that, and we'll go through all these 3 questions in the next 15 minutes or so to come. Question number 1 is why do we always see protests in countries where there are unjust regime of sort? Okay, I have put all that into the frame of game theory. So if one of you, or some more of you, happen to be game theorists, then please forgive me for the untechnical presentation. And if you happen to be not a game theorist, then please forgive me for the technical presentation. So it's somewhere in between technical and non-technical. So in a very simple way, we can think of a society with only two members who are pressed, and they have two options, either to protest or to acquiesce. And if they both opt for protesting, the situation will be better because they get rid of the old regime. But if they acquiesce, then the old regime stays in office and will be bad. And this is the simple setting by Karl Marx and others, because they would say, well, why leave it with a bad situation and a bad regime if we have an option to have a good regime? You have nothing to lose, then your chains, to go for it. But this ignores the microstructures of every group. And if we have protest of the masses of the population, this is always a group. And certainly they will not just consist of just two individuals, but we can even show or demonstrate what happens if it's just two individuals. And it becomes even worse if it's more than this, like a million or 80 or 50 million, whatever. Okay. Now, first problem that we will face in being a member of such a group is the so-called public good problem, which is known to every economist in the world. So think of the two members of the masses of the population. Once again, they can acquiesce or they can protest. And if they both acquiesce, then it remains bad. But if they both protest, it would be good. But each of them can only decide which option to take on his or her own. So number two would have the options to protest or to acquiesce. And it has this individual has an environment in which the respective other individuals protest or acquiesce. So if the others acquiesce and this person alone protests, they would end up in the worst of all situations. Okay, but if the other individuals protest and number two here protests as well, they are in a good situation. But it could be best. And the reason for that is that they could exploit the cooperation, so to speak, of all the others. So there is an incentive to remain silent, to stay away from protests, and let's do the others the job. Okay. In that case, we would predict that there would never be mass protests. However, what we do is we see that there are mass protests going on in the world, and maybe a reason for that is that the situation is slightly different from the one I have shown you in the last slide. And the reason for that, again, might be that each individual has some possibly very tiny benefit from protesting, even if the others would do the job on their own. Be it because you have the feeling to have been member of a big movement, or be it that you can tell your children that you did something against the regime or whatever. And if that is the case, then the situation for each individual is as follows. Look at person number two. He or she would acquiesce again or protest and have two environments. If the others acquiesce, then it would be bad if he or she did the same, but it would be much worse if he alone would protest. However, if the others protest, then it would be good for number two to protest as well, and it would be bad for not doing so. In that case, there might be an equilibrium where they all protest, but there might as well be an equilibrium where they all stay away from a protest. It's a situation with two equilibria, and once they're stuck in this equilibrium, there is no mechanism to lead them out of that trap in which they are. In order to see that there might be in certain defined situations like triggers that lead them to move from here to there. I can show you just another graph, which is looks a little bit more technical, but it's not as difficult as it looks like. So here on the horizontal axis, you have the number or the expected number of people that protest. Okay, so there might be 0, there might be all of the population as well. And here on the vertical number, you have the actual number of protesters, those that actually go out and protest. And then you have such a straight line here with a slope of 1, and on each of these, each point of this line, we have so-called expectation consistency, which means that the expected number of protesters is equal to the actual number of protesters. I don't want to go into the details of this line here, which is called a threshold line in theory, but what it says is as follows. From time to time, there might be some trigger, be it that the government has done something very wrong, it has rigged an election or whatever, launched a war, and there might be protests. But as long as the protest remains within some limit, it will always peter out. So it will always, along this line, converge to 0 again. However, once the expectation on the number of people moving and going out onto the streets and protest exceeds a certain critical number, a critical expectation, then what happens then is that we switch from one equilibrium, namely this one on the lower left-hand side, to another, and then there will be all, possibly the entire population out on the streets and revolting against the regime, and that spells revolution or not. Well, for the moment being, it means that we only have mass protests. Whether this will lead to an actual revolution remains a question to be clarified. But we haven't answered the question 1 at this point in time, because we can say that mass protests evolve under certain defined conditions, and if chance helps. Why chance? Because we would need that critical expectation that needs to be crossed in order to launch such a dynamic where in the end we have such a mess. And that can be triggered by all sorts of observations. As I said, that can be because of rigged election or anything else. But under most conditions, it is still the best option for each member of the population to just stay away from any protest activities, as long as they are costly. And in an autocracy, they are usually costly to the protesters and also their family. So that leads me to question 2. Given that indeed the masses do coordinate on protesting, okay, so that they switch from one equilibrium to the other, how do the security forces react to mass protests? That is the police forces, the military, the secret service, and so on. And this is indeed a very crucial question that has been explored during the past couple of years. And here I can illustrate that by a very simple graphical exposition here. Think of a population, so the masses, okay? And then, as we have seen, they might coordinate on protesting against an unjust regime, or they might acquiesce. Once again, if they opt for or coordinate on acquiescing, then that means that the regime remains stable. But if they protest, then the security force comes next, because they can and need to decide whether, in light of the protesting masses, they would remain loyal to the regime or switch to disloyalty. If they switch to disloyalty, then we have both conditions for a revolution, and there will actually be a revolution. Now look at what that means for the population, general population on the one hand, and the security forces on the other hand. Now, if the population acquiesces then the situation remains bad for them because the old regime is stable. For the security forces, this is not a problem because they are a member of that regime or a part of that regime. So for them, that would be good. If then there will be protests, okay, and the security forces decide to remain loyal to the regime, it's still good, but it might not be so good because in that case they are forced to strike down protests violently, and that means this utility for them because they all have family, they have friends, and they will be asked why they do these kind of things. So it might not be that good for the population. That might that would certainly be the worst situation you can think. But if there are protests and then the security forces switch to disloyalty, that would be good for the population, given that the old regime will be ousted and there will be a better regime to come. Now the question is, what about the security force? Would that be good for them as well? Or would that be more or less than this? So if it's less than not what I've said, written as not so good, then they will never become disloyal, as you can see here, okay? But if it would be better than not so good, then they will switch to disloyalty. So it all depends on what the result of a new regime would mean for the security forces, whether they could remain in office and all these kinds of things. And all that will be predicted by the population. So if they could predict that this here would be the end of the story, then they would acquiesce right away and not even go for protests. So it's very, very critical what happens here and here. And so what we can see is that it might be sufficient for the security forces to see the people protesting on the streets, and even if they are happy with the current regime, they might still coordinate on becoming disloyal and, for example, launching coup. We'll very briefly now show that the security forces too have a coordination problem, because they too are not a single person, but we need to look into the microstructures of the security forces. There are many people involved here, and we have a very similar situation to the masses here. So look at a situation where there are no mass protests. So if you have two of these representatives of the security forces, 1 and 2, and if they both remain loyal, it's just good for them. If they switch to disloyalty, this is also good for them, because there's a new regime, and then they will simply serve the new regime, which is fine for them. But if one of them switches to disloyalty, whereas the other remains loyal, look at the person 2 here, okay, then it's very bad for that person, because the regime will continue to exist, and that particular person has turned out to be disloyal. He or she will be arrested, killed, or whatever. So it would be very bad. In such a situation, this is the only and the unique equilibrium. It's technically speaking a Nash equilibrium in iterated strategies. Sorry for that. But that might change when there are mass protests. Why? Because remaining loyal in a situation where there are protests on the street might not be that good. So we have a minus here, somewhat smaller or a somewhat worse situation, and that might even suffice for that becoming another equilibrium. Okay, and what is more, a mass protest may change these situations as well. So it might be good plus something, minus something, and that means that one of these two equilibria that we have here becomes a bit more probable than the others. Okay, so it might be that the security forces resign loyalty to the regime only because there are people protesting on the streets. And what we can see empirically is that the probability of a military coup rises with probabilities of around 20% in light of mass protests. So it becomes much more probable, and that is a very rough explanation of that. So we haven't answered the question. 2 here, mass protests potentially destabilize the security forces established loyalty equilibrium where they remain loyalty. This may or may not end in the disloyalty equilibrium. So once again, it depends on the number of side effects and that whether there will in the end be a revolution. So if we have protesting masses, and if the security forces switch to disloyalty, that will definitely be a revolution. But this raises the third and last question, and that goes, will a post-revolution government do better than the old government? And here I have a last illustration of that. Look at the population and the security forces here, and there might be 2 situations where they coordinate on. Either they coordinate on a revolution, so there will first be mass protests and be disloyalty, and that means they will be here. But if that chain of causality does not hold, then we have regime stability, and we are here. Okay. Now, given that there is a revolution, a new government will be appointed, and that new government will have to decide. Let's assume that this will be a new government within the framework of a formal democracy. Then they have 2 options: either to respect the rules of the democratic game, or to disrespect the rules of the democratic game, in which case we have something like an autocratic backlash then, okay, which happens all the time, because in about 50% of all cases of democratization, we see within a range of about 20 to 30 years a move back to autocracy, like in Turkey, like in Russia right now, many other countries, okay? Now, if the regime remains stable, that will be bad for both the population and the security forces on one hand, and the new government, because the new government usually will have been part of the old mass population. Now, if there will be a revolution and the new government respects the rules of the game, it will be good for everybody except the old regime. Okay, so that would certainly be preferable to everybody. But if it happens that there will be a revolution, but then the new government disrespects the democratic game, then we are back in autocracy, and that's a situation which is bad, or might even be worse situation, because it might still be a worse regime compared to the ancient regime for some reason or another. And now the question is, how about the new government? So it might be the case that respecting the rules of the democratic game is the best option to them, but it might as well be that disrespecting of the game is still a little better for them. And in that case, the newly established democracy will turn out to be not self-enforcing. So it all depends on whether the government, the new democratic regime is self-enforcing. So we have a answer to question 3. It all depends on whether the newly established democratic regime is self-enforcing or not. And that in turn depends on deep and possibly historically institutional trade. There's a huge literature now on this question, whether newly established government, democratic regimes would be stable or not stable, and there is only a certain probability. Now, summing up, we can say, starting with an unjust regime, with oppression, exploitation, and discontent, all that, that might provoke just nothing. Okay, the old regime might remain stable, I wouldn't say forever, but for a long time. But it might as well provoke, under certain conditions, public unrest. And then it depends on the security elite whether that remains loyal or not. If it remains loyal, then again, the regime will be stable. Okay, but if public unrest provokes disloyalty of the security elite, then there will be a regime collapse. Okay. Next, an unjust regime might as well provoke insurrections or activities by revolutionary vanguards or so that, and that might lead or that might fail. Okay, in that case, the regime is again stable, or it might lead to a regime collapse. Now, next and in the last step, we will have the question as to whether a new regime will be a democratic regime, and whether the regime, the democratic regime, have self-enforcing rules or not. So, in one case, it has self-enforcing rules, then we have a just regime. Otherwise, it would be unjust. So, from the very left here to the very right, we have a number of different outcomes, of which one is a just regime, and the others may be regime stability or a new unjust regime, and these kinds of things. So the line of causality, that the naive line of causality, is just one possible line out of a big many number of other ways. So that's my deconstruction of the somewhat naive idea of revolution. And also, well, I forget that, because in case of regime collapse, it might also end in war, a failed state. That's about it, and it makes me a bit pessimistic about. I must confess that about the prospects of the population in autocracies, because we haven't seen so many cases in which there were revolutions, successful revolutions, and then revolutions that ended up in democracies. We have seen quite some of them in Eastern Europe following 1989, but that was just like a clustering of very lucky chains of causality, so to speak. But we must say that about half of all the countries that used to be member of the Soviet bloc by that time ended up either in autocracy right away or within a range of 10 or 20 years. So it's all taken from these publications. And thank you for all. It's been a little longer than I planned on, but sorry for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have quite a few questions, which I'm sure that others will have also clarifications. I shouldn't say question, clarifications. But I think we will come back to it at the end when we have a Q&A section. So to everyone, to the audience, please hold your questions, and maybe we can address them both with when both presentations are made. Excuse me. The second speaker is Professor Kadivar, and it's my great pleasure to introduce him. Professor Kadivar, Muhammad Ali Kadivar, is an assistant professor of sociology and international studies at Boston College. He holds a PhD in sociology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and earned his MA and BA in political science from the University of Tehran in Iran. From 2016 to 2018, Professor Kadivar was a postdoctoral fellow at Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. His work contributes to political and comparative historical sociology by exploring the causes, dynamics, and consequences of protest movements. His work grows out of his experience as a participant, observer of the pro-democracy movement in Iran, of course, but his research agenda has moved on outwards from this case to explore these similar issues on a global scale, using case studies, comparative historical methodologies, and statistical analysis. Professor Kadivar's research has been published in American Sociological Review, Social Forces, Comparative Politics, among others. And he has received awards from the Collective Behavior and Sociology Movement, from the comparative historical sociology, global and transnational sociology, sociology of development and peace, war, and social conflict sections of the American Sociological Association. His recent book, Popular Politics and the Path to Durable Democracy, has just been published. So with that, I am delighted to welcome you, and please join me in welcoming Professor Kadivar. The floor is yours. If you could please keep your remarks to 20-25 minutes, I would be grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. It's my great pleasure and honor to present my work for this esteemed audience. Today I'm going to speak about the consequences of Iranian Revolution, and particularly the socio-economic consequences of the Iranian Revolution. And I'm going to say it from the beginning. I think this is more of an agenda setting piece. I'm just trying to present some facts and set our observations right. So you might have more questions by the end of my presentation than you have right now. So the puzzle is about the outcome of revolutions and war. So over 170 years, I think, or even 200 years ago, since Tocqueville wrote his book about the French Revolution, there has been a lot of studies of revolutions. And bigger part of these studies has been about the cause of revolutions. We know much less about the impact and consequences or legacies of revolutions. This area is receiving some more attention recently, and this is the area I'm also focusing on. So overall, I'm asking, how do revolutions affect the state's developmental capacities? How do developmental trends change after the revolutions? And specifically, I look at the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which is mixed with the Iran-Iraq War. And this is not accidental. This is a feature of social revolutions. Social revolutions are often tangled with wars. We see this in the Chinese Revolution, in the Russian revolutions, and the other few successful social revolutions. So what do we know about revolutions and state capacity, revolutions, wars, and state capacity? There are classic studies on this topic. So I have a few pictures there you can see. The first one is a book by Charles Tilly. And there's one famous sentence that Tilly has said that is probably one of the most famous sentences in all social sciences. States make war and wars make state. The idea is that going through wars boosts the state capacities for extraction and for conscription, for war making. So that's one argument. Then we have an argument that Theodore Kochbull, American sociologist and political scientist, made about the American Civil War. That engagement, the American Civil War, had consequences for social policy because the American government started making some privileges and social provisions initially for war veterans, but then that extended to other parts of the population. So the Civil War led to later social policies, universal social policies. Finally, we have the classic work of Theodore Kochbull, State and Social Revolutions. This book came out in 1979, also the year of Iranian and Nicaraguan revolution, two social revolutions. And the book was a turning point for studies of revolutions. But most of the attention was to the first part of the book, when she talked about the causes of these three revolutions. In the second part of the book, she speaks about the outcome of revolutions. And she argues that the states that emerged out of the social revolutions that she examined, that were French, Russian, and Chinese revolution, had a stronger state capacity. There's a book also that came out last year. All of what I'm presenting here is based on my article that came out in summer of 2022 in Sociology of Development. This book came out after my article was published. So this is the most recent work about the impact of revolution, and it's the more advanced. So it's this book by Mark Beisinger that is a turning point in the studies of revolution. I think it has similar status to the Skocpol's book, and I mean, go read it. It's a big book, and it is quite detailed. When it comes to the outcomes, it makes a distinction between the outcome of social revolutions and urban civic revolutions, and also breaks down the outcome. So we can't expect just one type of outcome to repeat over other indicators. So political order is one, economic growth, income inequality, political freedom, and accountability. Social revolutions are the revolutions that don't just try to change the political regime, but just transform the social order. And then urban civic revolutions are the type we have seen more over the last decade or so, for example, in Arab Spring, that they are in urban areas. They're not trying to change the social order, but just bring down a tyrannical, corrupt government. And they rely on methods of civic resistance. And these two types of revolutions have different consequences. So just to say it very briefly, social revolutions create lasting social order, but urban civic revolutions don't. In terms of economic growth, social revolutions are highly detrimental for economic growth. And this is something that Professor Farzan Egan, also who has been involved in organizing the panel, he has an article about this in Iran. So this is not just Iran, it's the case for all the other social revolutions. Urban civic revolutions are not as detrimental for economic growth. Social revolutions decrease income inequality, urban civics not as much, but when it comes to political freedom and accountability, social revolutions are horrible for political freedoms and accountability, but urban civic revolutions slightly lift the situation and improve political freedoms and accountability. So Beisinger uses different indexes, but cross-national indexes to look at these factors. I'm looking only at one country, so I will be looking at some indicators that I think he didn't have access to look at for all of the countries. So one of the things, for example, that he finds out is that social revolutions and urban civic revolutions, or basically any type of revolutions, they improve they improve educational and health situation in their respective countries. So this is the overall literature about the impact, small literature about the impact of revolution. And then we have the case of Iran. What do we know about the effects of Iranian revolution for social development? So now we are 44 years after the Iranian revolution, and there are 4 decades to assess what has happened since. And there has been a lot of debates about cause of the Iranian revolution. As the debates still continue, and they are also mixed with the political situation, so they also get kind of caricaturized. We have like something from conspiracy theory to more serious social scientific theory about the revolution. And now we have also some debates emerging about the causes, the consequences of revolution, but those are also very political and polarized. So on the one side, you have the Islamic Republic that they, of course, say we have done such a tremendous job and improved the country. And then on the other hand, you have the opposition that says the Iranian, like Islamic Republic has been just a failed government, everything has been ruined and declined. A discourse that is very similar to what we had 44 years ago at 79. Again, very polarized. Shah claimed that he has led the country into progress. The revolutionary opposition claimed that Shah has only ruined the country. So other than the social scientific literature, we also have the revolutionary promises. We all know about the famous speech that Khomeini gave, and he said he's going to give free electricity and free water and so on and so forth. And now people, when they steal electricity, they call it Imam electricity. Social justice is written into the Constitution, and the Constitution makes big promises in terms of the provision of welfare and social services to the population, housing, health, education, and so on and so forth. Much more extensive than the Constitution from before the revolution. And the developmental plans, we have had developmental plans after the war, they also make promises and set goals for development of the country. So what has happened since? How has developmental trends changed after the revolution? So I make three simple suggestions here that they may seem obvious to you, but a more like deeper and thorough look into the literature or statements of politicians or what the discussions we see in public sphere show that they are not very obvious, at least in those discussions. So I suggest to look at multiple indicators for the simple reason that you might observe progress in one indicator, you might observe decline in another indicator. Not all good things go together, not all bad things go together. So the results could be mixed and inconsistent. We have to look at pre and post-revolutionary trends. I say, do you think this is obvious? But one reason I wrote this article was I was teaching a course about Iranian Revolution, and I was reading the lot of books that exist about the political social history of Iran. Let me give you one simple example. Many of these works mentioned that at the time of the revolution in 79, the literacy in Iran was 47%, and now it's over 80% or 87%. This shows the progress we have made under the Islamic Republic. I think a few months ago, the spokesperson of the government also made the same type of comparison. This type of comparison basically loses the context of what was happening before and where the progress started. And so we should look at pre and post, and where we observe continuity, we can simply also look at the pace of the change and see if that has changed or not. So I just take these three principles and I look at a number of indicators. So I look at indicators of health, education, poverty, income inequality, housing. And what I find overall is mixed results. Rather than the improvements anticipated by the literature or the promises made by post-revolutionary leaders or the claims that currently the political leaders are making. Of course, the indicators are not exhausting. You can add more indicators, but I think this is the most comprehensive what I have seen so far. I hope to see more indicators examined. And also one more thing, that I'll stay at the level of observation here. I'm not doing any causal inference here for any of these indicators. More sophisticated methods can be used. So let me show you why just looking at the post could be misleading. So this is female life expectancy in Iran after 1980. You see female life expectancy has gone up. Great success for post-revolutionary regime. I have seen this in some books. This is, again, I'm not making this stuff up. So, but now let's add the multiple indicators. Let's break it down to female, male, pre and post. And this is what you see. So that line I was showing you is just right from here. When you just look at this part, you don't see this part. Similar to the situation with literacy. And then when we break it down with, this is the total, this is female, and this is male. If you look at this one, it's completely misleading. So we clearly see a decline in male life expectancy, which is probably related to the results of war, and which we see also in the total life expectancy. So the idea that the health has been improved after the revolution is a little challenge here. Okay, sorry. Another indicator to look at is, so here for the female life expectancy, this one at the bottom, we can look at the pace of the change because the line continues. So when we look at the pace of the change, we see a turning point around the time of the revolution, that more and more was being added to the female life expectancy, but then it becomes less and less. Now we may say this might have happened for other reasons. Sure, we don't know if this is not causal inference, but let's look at other indicators. Another indicator, health indicator we can look at is infant mortality per 1,000 births. Again, the line has continued. It has declined after the revolution, but it was also declining before the revolution. We don't observe a break in the line. If the revolution was making a big impact, we would see a break in the line. Now, if we look at the pace of the change again, this is what we see, and this is very, I think, telling here. So more children have been saved before and after the revolution. So the progress has been consistent, but the pace of the progress was becoming faster. The car, if it was a car, the car was accelerating. When it comes in 1979, the car is decelerating, coming to now. Again, this might be for other reason, but we are seeing this pattern. So let's look at other indicators. For other indicators of health, so these ones I presented so far, this is just from World Bank, everyone can access to it. But I wanted to dig deeper, so I went to the statistical yearbooks, and I just got these numbers out of a statistical yearbook. So the first thing I looked at was the number of hospital beds in total and per population. It's another indicator of the access to health for the population. And this is what we see again. So that pattern kind of continues. So here again, the number of hospital beds are increasing at the bottom, and then for a few years, nothing happens because the revolution basically stops the process. Again, the progress continues, but it doesn't catch up with the population growth. So hospital beds per 100,000 basically declines. It takes 3 decades for this ratio to catch up with what it was at 1979. Another indicator, again, I extracted from the statistical yearbooks was the number of doctors that were in the country. Again, it is another indicator of health. So this is, again, number of doctors, and the bottom is just the raw number. The top is weighted by the population. And we observed decline in both. The weighted number has had a more drastic decline. So a lot of doctors basically leave the country after the revolution. And again, it takes 30 years for this number to catch up with the ratio we had in 1979. So this is overall what we observe in terms of health. So for education, I look only at literacy. There are, of course, more indicators to look at. So overall, at the literacy, what we saw that the overall ratio of literacy progressed after the revolution, but it was also progressing before the revolution. And the progress is pretty much on par. So again, I broke this down to male literacy, female literacy, and rural and urban. And this is, again, what we know is that, again, after the revolution, the results for urban literacy was better. We had larger increases, and for also female literacy, especially urban, rural female literacy. Again, I'm not making causal identification claim, just in terms of observations, we see that these trends have progressed with faster pace after the revolution. Other indicator to look is poverty rates. These are from the surveys that the government has been doing before and after the revolution, and Professor Javad Saleh Esfahani has calculated this to get at the poverty rate level. So it is interesting. We observed a decline in poverty rates after the revolution, but we also saw this happen before the revolution. And we really have to pay attention to oil prices. What has happened that this has gone up and down with oil prices. The price goes up, the GDP goes up. This is also absolute poverty, it's not relative poverty. So more money just goes into the society, and more people are lifted above the poverty line. So again, the question is that at both periods, before and after the revolution, when the oil prices have increased, the percentage of population under absolute poverty has decreased. So then what is it about the revolution or the post-revolutionary regime that has changed? Has anything changed? Because under both pre and post-revolutionary regimes, we observe the same.
Can I just quickly ask you, this is international poverty line or national poverty line?
No, it's just for Iran. This is just for Iran.
Yeah.
This is just for Iran. It's from the پیمایش خانواده, the household survey. Yeah. So that's for poverty, and then for Gini coefficient and basically indicators of income inequality. This is data from the central bank, which is again based on the household survey. So we observed a decline right after the revolution with Professor Fazanigan. We have an article on this topic, and we used synthetic control methods. So we use causally that this was caused by the revolution, but this is only the decline in 1980 in the level of income inequality. And it's basically because the government expropriated wealth from the top earners. So this is because the top of the income pyramid was decapitated. It's not because the bottom was lifted. It's different in like Russian or Chinese revolution that, for example, did land distribution and land reform, but land reform was done already in Iran. After 1980s, when the war ends and the economy pretty much comes back to its pre-revolutionary principle, based on this indicator, we observe stagnation with the caveat that I think over the 10, 15 years, the no response rates to the survey have increased. So we can be a little cautious about it. And there's also another indicator, international indicator that I use with Professor Fazanigan that shows increase in income inequality after 1980s. So I think it's we don't have good indicators. Best indicators we can have are tax receipts, but to have good tax receipts, you need a tax system. We don't have that, so we don't know much. And then I look at the percentage of households that have a house. And this is also from census. It's in the census, but like a lot of other data that just sits in the census or statistical yearbooks. I don't know if anyone had looked at this or used this. We saw again the same break happening around the revolution. So as you see, the percentage of homeowners are increasing up to 76 census, which is the recent census before the revolution. It comes to over 80%, and then the percentage declines. So based on the last census, it's around 60%, and this is where we were in 1956. So I mean, people have not lost houses, but younger households that have been added, I think, have not been able to buy a house. This could be okay if renting was affordable, but we all know that renting is not affordable, and renting prices are also really going up. So in this sense, also we saw a decline and failure for post-revolutionary policies for house ownership. And finally, another data that I came across again sitting in the statistical yearbook, which I thought was interesting, was suicide per 100,000 people. The suicide rates is still lower than average in the world. In Iran, in general, suicide rates in Muslim countries is lower than the world average. But we observe a big hike right after the war ends. And this is, again, consistent with other studies of suicide rates after wars and revolutions, this type of upheavals. Basically, it becomes 4 times bigger, from around 1% per 100,000. It jumps to, after the revolution, to over 4% per 100,000. Again, this is also from statistical yearbooks for HE. So overall, we observe a mixed outcome. And to look further into this, we should explain both post-revolutionary improvements and failures. It's not all improvements, it's also not all failures. And so the part that I'm interested, that I talk more in the article, I'm happy to speak about in the Q&A, is how the post-revolutionary politics have affected this. A few dimensions of politics that have changed in Iran. One is we have seen higher levels of mobilization after the revolution. This is both mobilization against the government. This is mobilization within the government, such as elections. And this is also mobilization by the government, which is in the form of the war mobilization. And later we see it in the pro-government events that the government sponsors itself. Another thing that has changed is elite factionalism that we haven't had much of it pre-revolution, but factional politics has been a part and parcel of the Islamic Republic after. And we should look into how this has basically compromised the bureaucracy or have created opportunities for socioeconomic progress. And finally, a higher level of tension and conflict with the international, at the interregional and international level after the revolution. This is also another factor to look at for assessing why we see certain improvements and say certain failures. I'll end my words here, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting analysis. It is very interesting to see at the level of change. I just wanted to make a few one remark, if you permit me, about education attainments, or at least two remarks about education attainments. One is that, of course, we hear always, education before the revolution was X, and now, it is Y, and look at the great progress. But when you compare Iran's educational attainments, both for male as well as female, as well as, university participations and everything, it is truly in line with international trends, in the sense that, even in other countries, there has been a great increase in female education. There's been a great interest in great progress in narrowing the gaps, income gaps and everything. It has been, in other words, it is important to put Iranian progress in post-revolution, particularly in context with other countries, with some perhaps comparators. The same thing, of course, goes for pre-revolutionary comparison. How much faster or slower did Iran progress in comparison to some of its peers? So that's one comment that I wanted to make. The second comment is that I remember I lived during the pre-revolutionary times, and there were, particularly in rural areas, it was very some of these religious leaders were truly discouraging some families, particularly the more conservative families, from either sending their daughters to school, or letting them progress as far as they could. So in other words, there were some incredible barriers to women's education that were difficult to overcome, that after the revolution became less of an issue. So that is something that I wanted to maybe add to your excellent analysis. Professor Apolte, I have a question to start with, while in the Q&A section, and I want to remind everyone to put in their questions. Questions come up. One is that a lot of times, particularly at this particular junction that we find ourselves with respect to the Iranian protests, everyone says, well, there is lack of leadership, and if there had been a known one or two or three leaders that these leaderships this leadership, I would say that the Iranian protests suffer from a leadership deficit. To what extent does that figure in your model? Because you mentioned the security forces, but it kind of assumes that there is or there isn't a leader, an alternative to the current regime. So if you could perhaps maybe elaborate a little bit on that matter. And then I have also another question. In the Iranian context, people talk a lot about the gray layer, or what at least they refer to Hannah Arendt as being one of the proponent of this gray layer, and that this gray layer is satisfied with economic, well-being, as long as they have food on the table and everything. To what extent could this be the case, or at least how does that figure into your model, if I were to put it this way? And because at what point in time would that gray layer, قشر خاکستری, as they say in Persian, or those who are sitting on the fence, come in? The reason why I'm asking that is because during the 1979 revolution, economic well-being was quite, it was at an acceptable stage, and people still chose to go out and protest. Whereas today, economic well-being is far below below expectations, or even below what people could tolerate, and people are still not coming out in drones. Of course, the security forces may have a role to play in that context. So that is one or two questions that I would like to pose to you, and then we will go to Q&A. Thank you very much for both presentations. They are both eye-openers and very thought-provoking. Thank you. To you, Professor Apolte.
Thank you. Do you want me to ask to respond to the two questions now?
Yes.
Yes. I must say what I've presented here are very, very rough illustrations of problems, structures that have been intensely discussed in formal literature. And it's interesting that you ask about leadership, because leadership can play a very decisive role in mobilization of both masses that will go out on the streets to protest on one hand, but then also on the side of the security force. Because as we can always see, is that those groups, be it the masses or security forces, can be stuck in what we would call a bad equilibrium. Okay, so everybody wants something to change, but if it is not clear that all the others would join in some action to be taken, then there is hardly a chance of the group as a whole to coordinate on such action. And then there might be some revolutionary leader or a vanguard, and these people can have the role or have a function as a trigger that helps the individuals to coordinate on becoming active. We have seen that in many cases. For example, very prominent in Europe, in Poland, we had we had on the one hand, we had the Pope actually, who was not a revolutionary, but was a figure that helped the people to coordinate on action against the government, and to, for example, to come out, so to speak, with their thoughts, to make it clear on which side they were. And then later on, they had that they had the Solidarność, and there was a prominent leader, Wałęsa, and he played a huge role as a leading figure of high moral standards and all that. So that does certainly play a role, and there are a number of very interesting papers, theoretical papers, that show how that works. And it goes as far as looking at individuals that are really ready or willing to sacrifice, like Navalny in Russia. If you keep in mind that he traveled back from Berlin to Moscow, just knowing that he would be arrested right away, and that it can be explained because he might have believed that helped the people coordinate in protesting against the regime. Whereas that worked out in the case of Poland with Wałęsa, it didn't work in Russia with Navalny. So it really depends on particular circumstances. on the side of the population as a whole, and then on the side of the security forces, we have mainly what I would call active disloyalty of security forces, which would be like military coups or so. And if you have a prominent coup leader, then the probability of to be successful is significantly higher than if it's just a group that tries to coordinate in a certain way without having a leading figure. Well, that's for this question for the moment. And then if you ask for the gray layer, I would say, given that these individuals are more or less personally fine with the regime and the circumstances and their economic well-being also, they have little reason to do something against the regime. If it's not for moral reasons, that they will say, well, me personally, I'm in a situation that's just fine for me, but I would never accept a regime as it is in my country for some religious, ideological reasons or whatever, saying I want to live in a democracy. And then there is little reason for them to join in and protesting groups and the like. But then again, when the situation becomes worse, the regime becomes less stable, and when there is a chance that, or a rising chance, also like a two-digit chance that the regime might collapse, then they might be forced, for example, if they hold high-ranking positions in society, that they would confess to this or that standard, saying, "Well, I'm against or for that respective regime," and if the probability that the regime might collapse is high enough, then they will change sides and join in to protest as well, even though they personally were happy with the situation as it used to be before the regime became unstable for some reason or another.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask Kamiar to kind of let us know about who has been asking questions and maybe pass it on to the audience who want to pose their questions in person. Otherwise, I can read the questions. Kamiar, do you want to tell us who wants to pose any questions? Yeah.
Thanks, Nadereh. I've just promoted a couple of people to talk. I don't know if they want to talk. I don't know if they noticed, but Hashem is one, Valentin is one, and others I can promote if you're happy to talk. Otherwise, we can just read out your questions.
So, Valentine, if you could please make your comment or question. Good to see you also. Valentine, Val?
Sorry, yeah, right. Sorry about that. Hello to everybody. And I'm sorry that I had to miss the first presentation because I had a student here that I needed to speak with. I've actually read the paper that Ali Kadivar wrote with his co-author. I think one point to make is simply to echo what Nadereh, what you said too, that comparisons with similar countries, I think before and after, are a very useful way of being able to assess the rate stagnation or change. That's one point. The other one is that, Ali, I know that you've been looking at specific indicators of health and literacy, poverty, income inequality, there were studies at the beginning of the revolution on poverty and income inequality, and some studies since then. Masoud Karchanos, for example, with Hashem Pesaron, did this work on income inequality at the very beginning of the revolution. And of course, Masoud much more recently has been emphasizing how very unequal Islamic Republic has been, along with countries like Tunisia, Turkey, and so on. But, you have to give credit where some credit is due. And the comment that I posed was about electrification in Iran after the revolution. And my late father, who was living in Iran the whole time, was an engineer, was traveling all over the country, etc. I remember distinctly when he sent me a letter, and basically he said, and then of course when he came to visit, he explained that all of Iran was now had electricity, which surprised him, impressed him, and was something that I think is one of the, dare I say, few contributions of the Islamic Republic, in addition to, for example, the family planning program that it had put in place, and there's been so many studies on the subject. So I just wanted you to address this question of electrification throughout the country, I mean, we could compare it, I suppose, to the very poor quality of electrification in the United States, where you have all these exposed power lines and power goes off all the time when there's some rain and snow. So electrification as well as the family planning program. Thank you.
Would you like to answer this question or comment?
Yeah.
And we go.
So yeah, the point about comparison is right. As I said, I'm not doing that in this paper. But when with Professor Fazanegan, we use synthetic control method, that's basically what it does. It does that comparison systematically. But it's become its whole thing, how to select your cases and set up the comparison, because we just don't want to choose some countries that give us one conclusion, and if we change it, give it another conclusion. But yes, that's important. That's something that needs to be done. In terms of electricity, electrification has been happening before and after the revolution. I think the achievement after the revolution is electrification in rural areas. That has happened with much higher rates. As I mentioned, literacy gains also in rural areas has been considerable after the revolution. So electrification, also piped water and pipe gas, but there was not much pipe gas before the revolution, even in urban,
that's true.
Urban areas. But this is also ironic, because basically the country has been urbanizing, and the proportion of rural population of total population has been shrinking before and after the revolution. So some of the major achievements of Islamic Republic is in this part of the population that has been shrinking. And the irony is that Iranian revolution was an urban revolution, but the major winner, one of the major winners were the rural areas, which is a little paradoxical. I read a couple of other questions I can answer or wait, because I think they are also on the panel, so they can ask them then. We can talk.
Thank you. I actually, on this issue of urbanization, I was looking at some numbers. About 75% of Iranian population is now urban, and Iran has experienced one of the fastest urbanization trends in West Asia, at least in Asia. What is interesting is because a lot of people blamed the 1979 revolution on the fact that there was a big urbanization, and that should have been, and that urbanization should have been controlled rather than, sort of like let go loose. But anyway, it's interesting that the urbanization after the revolution has been so much faster than before the revolution. I think the next person in line is Hashem Pesaron. Greetings to you, Hashem. Good to see you here. If you would like to ask your question. we're delighted to have you. We're delighted to have everyone.
Okay,
but
I just wasn't going to talk. I mean, it's very interesting topics. I've been spending quite a lot of my life thinking about these problems. I think looking at the revolutionary upheaval, this kind of a comparative methods that people use, I find that not could be relevant, because it's what is the people think at the time, not how the people in Iran think relative to what they were in Afghanistan, or if they were in Iraq, or they were in Syria. So I'm sorry, so I mean, I know we do a lot of economics, they do synthetic control, and we become a rage, which I think is misguided in the case of Iran. I just gave the interview on Echo of Iran. People are in Iran thinking about, oh, look what happened, sanction against Russia, and the ruble hasn't fallen. So, well, look, we can deal with Iranian rial. We don't need to worry about sanction. I mean, these are all these kind of comparisons, unfortunately, could be problematic. But nevertheless, I think what matters is what makes people so upset that in group, in coordination, come out. And that's what I was asking one of my questions. I mean, inflation, uncertainty, none of them were mentioned. I mean, just when I talk to everybody in Iran, my colleagues, my friend, they know I'm an economist. The first thing they ask me, what is happening to rial? I mean, I remember the first time I went to Iran after revolution, before I set foot to Iran, the guy on the border, before he let me in, he recognized my name. I used to give talk on BBC. The first thing he asked me, what's going to happen to rial? That was first question. And it is not unimportant. I mean, we can't just have a discussion of Iranian people and revolution without worrying their concern. That was worried me. That's why I wrote the question of excess in some way. And in fact, one of my concerns is that this is getting worse and worse. I mean, if inflation in Iran is gone from every presidential time about 20% on average, now is moving to 40%, 50%. It could go. One of my concerns was that. So these are the forces that could be much more important, just as this comparative urbanization. All those issues are important, by the way. We should all look at them. But I think, firstly, I don't think comparative analysis is that necessarily helpful in understanding what Iran is going through and the people in Iran going through.
Your question is to Professor Apolte, or is it?
As well, yeah. My other question was that when we looked at revolution, people, one of the reasons Iran revolution happened is it wasn't Marxian deprivation, or wasn't because people weren't improving their income. The income inequality was worsening, but not that much. But income was rising. It was unfulfilled expectations. In the theory of Dr. Apolte, there were no discussion of expectations. Means people expectations if it's not fulfilled. I remember Hirschman in his famous book about loyalty, voice or exit, which is the classic, applies to Iran at the time. He says that imagine you are in a tunnel and both sides, traffic is jammed and you are not moving at all. You sit there, you have nothing to do. You're not moving, but nobody's moving. But as soon as one side starts to move and you don't move, you get cross. You create chaos. And I think that is a different theory that was happening nowadays. Also, the theory nowadays is about people see a lot of people getting rich in Iran through rent seeking, through corruption, through connection to the regime, and the rest of them have to worry about their day-to-day activities and their inflation, uncertainty, what's going to happen to their life. And that's another form of revolutionary forces. I don't see this thing being discussed. I mean, this kind of you talk about division, but division is not just the people are rich and poor. The people rich getting richer, wealthier. I don't mean just income, wealthier, but the poor, they seem stagnant. They are not getting anywhere. These are the things which we need to, in my view, focus as well. By the way, I enjoyed listening and all very important discussion. So it's not a negative comment. It's just trying to supplement what you guys have been saying. Sorry.
And if I can maybe add to it, to what Hashem was saying, that people are upset that people are getting richer, but through rent and corruption. I think that's a very important qualifier in the case of Iran. But please, Professor Apolte, if you would like to address the comments or the question that was posed.
Well, most of that, as I understand it, were more comments than questions. What I want to say or make clear is that in my very simple presentations here, I haven't used any numbers. I have just given ordinal ideas about how people perceive their personal situation, and I use the words like good or bad or worse or that, and these are just ordinal comparisons, so to speak, and they might refer to all kinds of things that people that might be important for people. So that might be their personal income situation, that might be their situation with respect to the income or wealth distribution within that respective society. But it might as well refer to the political situation, to the degree of liberty and personal freedom and all these kinds of things. It's not just an economic analysis. It's just that people evaluate the situation as being from their personal point of view good or bad, and whether they want to do something about it. And what I'm focusing on is that I've mentioned all these chains of causalities from for example, deprivation or some state of deprivation or some level of deprivation according to some criteria on to protest. And what I find important is that we look into the microstructures of the respective groups in order to see whether they will get or remain stuck in a situation where everybody does just nothing, but everybody as well is somehow discontent and not satisfied with the current situation. And also, I've read a question or a comment by some other person that refers to that, who said that in the presentation I gave, I would not focus enough on the interaction of individuals and and between groups, and that might again be due to the very simplified presentation I gave here, because in each of these presentations represents more a literature on the respective piece of causality that I'm interested in, and not a model that I presented. And it is indeed what I'm interested in, that is the interaction of the individual members of a certain, so to speak, a latent group, a huge group or so, and then the interaction between the group. For example, I mentioned what might impact on the behavior or the propensity members of a security force on coordinating on a military coup, and that indeed we have been observing on an empirical basis. I mentioned that before, that the onset of mass protests raises the probability of military coups, this kind of thing. And this is an example of the interaction between respective groups, and that's the very thing I'm actually interested in. Yes, indeed, there is much to be done and to be explored in more detail. We have mentioned the role of revolutionary vanguard, and these people play a certain role. And I also said that there are some partly very famous papers that have written on that, but it still it's not entirely clear how and what how the interaction in this microstructure is, how it works, and what would lead to some sort of a full-fledged causal chain running all the way from a certain degree of deprivation on to, for example, a newer regime that might be democratic and and a certain degree of liberty and all that. So it's, if you want, it's work in progress in all sorts of fields and all sorts of levels, which I wanted to just to use just model.
Tommy John, I will pass it on to you, who was going to be next speaker, if you could please.
I think is Daniel.
Okay, thank you for joining. Daniel.
Hello, thank you. My question's regarding demographic change, because we have witnessed the baby boom of the revolutionary period, and those people are now in their mid to late 30s. But one of the issues that I've noticed when I'm looking at the statistics in Iran is a good proportion of the educated population and those who are more working class are leaving the country, which then leaves a huge problem in terms of the next generation following. There's also the lack of babies being born, which is obviously an existential crisis for Iran as a whole and for the system that governs it. With that being the case, I mean, there won't, do you believe, and this goes to Thomas and Ali and Nadereh, if you feel like you want to answer this, do you feel that population demographic shifts are going to be basically hampering any change in the political situation in Iran? Because if aging populations are the key trend in Iran now, and Iran's very early retirement age remains as it is, do you believe that little will be done because the young population will be so small in comparison to, say, around the revolutionary period?
Ali, maybe you can answer it, and I have a few comments that I can add at the end. Thank you very much for your question.
Thank you, Miss.
Yeah, well, I guess this is more a matter of a speculation. I cannot give a certain answer, but yeah, mostly youth participate in revolutions, but they're not the only group. Revolutions that succeed are often multi-sectoral coalitions. So youth participate, older groups participate, different unemployed participate, sometimes public servants participate in the revolutions. This type of configurations change. I guess it makes it difficult, perhaps, but it doesn't make it, it does not make it impossible, because you need a critical mass. So around hundreds of thousands of people, 1 or 2 million, 3 million, not the whole population of a country participate in a revolution. It's always a small proportion, but when they come out and they take action, then they can make that type of change. So I would say it makes it challenging for that type of thing to happen, and but it doesn't make it impossible. What we have observed so far is the opposite, though. I think youth has participated in some of these recent episodes. We haven't seen the participation of older population groups. So the number of participants for the last revolutionary episodes of Mahsa Amini, 2019, 2017, 18, Alban, and they overall has been low. It's not been at the level, so it's not surprising that it has not achieved the political goals that they have set for themselves. I can also answer questions that I see in Q&A.
Can I just maybe add to this very interesting question that was posed? Let me see whether I can add an observation. I wanted to just to quickly maybe show you. Can I just do share screen just a second? This is Iran's population structure, and somewhere around here, if you can see me, is it possible around here? And what's above here is are people who were born before the revolution. So this group is born after the revolution. And while I think I agree that in the long run, the aging of the population will be an important factor. But for the next 10 to 15 years, Iran will still have a huge youth bulge. But when you look at it, it's like, I think in a way, actually the demographics are calling for another revolution, because this group of people, which is probably 60, 70, 80%, is not going, has no or has very little affinity with what were the causes of the revolution, of what caused the revolution in 1979. So in a way, you would almost think that, perhaps the writing is on the wall in terms of the demographics for and against the revolution. The other point that I want to make is that actually the Iranian government has totally reversed the population policy. Valentine referred to a very successful population or family planning policy that came into being around 1990s. The Iranian government has essentially totally abolished that, and in fact taken into account, or at least put in place, some really unusual measures to really grow the population and increase family sizes. So that I wanted to add. Sorry, Ali, I just wanted to insert that since this question was raised. Please go ahead with your comments, please.
About the family planning, I want to also add, so we know, yes, the family planning they enforced in like mid to late 80s was successful, but also the policies they did right after the revolution was terrible. We have an excess increase in Iranian population. Yes, they made plans later, but a lot of babies were already born, and then when they're born, you have to provide with them. And we see them in all the indicators. The government just cannot keep up with them. So that's why we see such like drastic decline in the ratio of like doctors to population, hospital beds to population. So we have to see the whole thing, not just focus on, yes, they did one family planning, was successful, but there was also those years that they didn't do, and they even reversed the policies that the pre-revolution regime, and the results already happened. That could not be reversed. And now they have dismantled that program. So it's not overall a successful program. There's the middle part that was successful, and the early part, and now later part that they're dismantling those type of policies. I see one question about the difference between social revolutions and urban civic revolutions that I mentioned. So this is a distinction that Mark Weisinger makes. Social revolutions, again, the definitions of revolutions that want to change the whole class, social orders, and so on. And there were ideologies such as communism, socialism, and later Islamism that wanted to change the society in those respects. But pretty much we can see that the era of social revolutions are over. Iranian revolution in a way was a turning point, because most of these social revolutions have become rural in the mid-20th century, such as Chinese Revolution. Iranian revolution was urban, also it was social, it was of 1709. And then it was Nicaragua. Since then, the only perhaps social revolution that has been succeeded is Taliban, an Islamist revolution, but in a country that is still a big part of it is rural. And the conditions for social revolutions have changed. These revolutions mostly happen in countries that were based on agriculture. The government bureaucracy was weak. These are the conditions that the Skocpol specifies for her social revolution. But the type of revolutions have changed. What we saw in Ukraine, in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Philippines, and so on and so forth. Those are urban civic revolutions. They happen in urban areas. The revolutionary goals are quite limited. It's about the tyrannical or corrupt government being declined, and it relies on nonviolent methods of concentrating population in big urban spaces. Social revolutions mostly relied on armed insurgency. Social, again, Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution, Cuban Revolution, Nicaraguan Revolution, and so on. And overall, there are I think maybe 9 successful social revolutions that have happened. We have had more successful urban civic revolutions, but with what I said, that their outcomes and legacies are different. And I cannot think of an urban civic revolution that has turned to a social revolution. I think the reason is that the just structural conditions of societies have changed. Part of it is just urbanization. The strength of the state capacity. Again, social revolutions happen mostly in lower state capacity countries. But it's an interesting distinction, and I think, and this type of revolutions, different conditions lead to the eruption of these revolutions, and this could be a comment for Thomas's commentary that was just lumping all sort of revolutions together. I think they are not the same. Conditions that lead to social revolutions are different from the ones that lead to urban civic revolutions, and the consequences are also different. What is, I think, very distinct about Mark Weisinger's book is that it's the first book that has a complete data set of all the revolutions that happened from 1900 to, or revolutionary episodes from 1900 to 2014. So the comparisons and the conclusions are based on the whole population of revolutionary episodes with certain definition. Of course, we can challenge the definition, add some more, drop some more, but this is the only work that has done this work so far, and that's why I think it is already a turning point in the studies of revolutions.
Thank you. Kamircan, back to you.
Thank you,
Yes.
Nadereh. Turajun, I don't know whether that answered your questions or if you want to chip in, please feel free.
Thank you. But no, my question was that, I mean, the distinction you made, I mean, of course, I mean, you referred to the, but the distinction you made is not clear to me because, as I mentioned in my question, I think the urban civic revolution has got the potential to play a role of a catalyst for a social revolution. That happened. This is my reading of Iranian Revolution of 1979.
Yeah, I think 1979 had the features of both. It was both urban civic, but it had the ideology of changing the whole society from before. It didn't happen right after. In some ways, we don't have those type of ideologies anymore either. Like Ukrainian revolutions, Tunisian, Egyptians, and current protests in Iran, they don't even have that type of ideology that they want to change the whole social structure. And that's, I think, something that Asif Bayat also talks about in his work, in a way that revolutions in the neoliberal era.
I think with this, are there any other questions, any further questions? We have now, I think, also gone about 20 minutes over time, but I think it's important to cover everything. No, I see one more question. Sorry, go ahead.
Mahmoud. It's Mahmoud.
Yeah.
Sorry, do you want to ask a question? I'll ask a question, put it on the question list. The legitimacy of the pre- and post-revolution regimes are crucial for the success or failure of the revolution. And in Iran, if you note, after the revolution, as Hashim has already noted, there has been a decline in the participation in several elections and coming down to, well, sort of dramatically. The other issue here is delivery on the promises of revolution. The Iranian regime after revolution had to deliver on certain promises which were made, and those promises worked their way into the constitution even. So this was not a charity on the side of the regime which took over. It was part and parcel of a change in Iran. The other point that I would like to make is to do with the continuity from the pre-revolution to post-revolution economic changes. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a massive investment in infrastructure and also to do the social policy, for example, to do with the social policy in relation to female literacy to some extent, and to much more importantly, to do with population the management, and if you like, control. And those policies were also took over after the revolution. So the blip that Professor Kadivar relates to the increase in population growth after revolution, in fact, that is typical of post-war fertility increase. So the underlying trend has been on the declining trend, plus the increase in female literacy, which has been crucial in the decline in fertility, plus increase in the age of marriage and the age of first child. So if we take all these things together, the increase in the fertility immediately after the war is, in my view, is not very relevant. And as Nadereh has already pointed out, in terms of the age pyramid, Iran is not aging. Iran is aging rapidly compared with other countries, but we have a large population who are under the age of 30 and who are under the age of 40 or 50. So we should not worry about the issue of aging in Iran for the next 20 or 30 years. So the hullabaloo in Iran about population aging is literally nonsense when you consider countries like South Korea and other places which have gone through the same process and have grown rapidly over a 20-year period where they had a youth bulge. So aging, in my view, is neither here nor there in terms of the economic problems of Iran, to be honest with you. That can be managed with increase in age of retirement, plus employment of people in different age groups, and employment of women. Iran has got one of the lowest labor force participation by women in the world. So there is a lot of untapped labor resources which can contribute to development of Iran. So two simple questions: question legitimacy and question of the labor availability in the Iranian economy, potential labor, I should say. Thank you.
Thank you. Was that a question to Professor Kadivar or to Professor Apolte?
To both of them, because legitimacy is part of the agenda of both speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Apolte, maybe you would like to
Well, yes,
answer
thank you.
this question.
I mean, you largely referred to the Iranian case, but the question of legitimacy in terms of the theoretical considerations I made is that the kind of influences the expectations of those that might participate in social action activities and the protest activities. So if they expect a coming regime to be legitimate in a certain way, then that might, of course, help them coordinate on social action. But then again, of course, the Iranian case was not oriented toward a Western-type democracy, but it was much more a complex thing, which I'm not an expert on. It had to do with traditional values, it had to do with religion, and it had to do that with the fact, at least to me, that the Shah regime was on one hand related to the West, but on the other hand, it was a dictatorship, and so it seems to me that the revolution was driven, of course, by the expectation that another regime to come would be more legitimate. But then again, following the revolution, things turned out to be at least slightly different, and that is, of course, one of the problems that we have in mind in our theoretical considerations, because of many cases of revolutions that turned out to be not delivering in according whatever the aims were. And I believe that even for a more traditional or somebody oriented toward, for example, Islamic Republic by the end of the 1970s, did not have in mind what would happen then in reality once the revolution was accomplished. But I'm, of course, not an expert on Iranian revolutions. I focus more on democracy revolutions. And so I leave it with that comment.
Thank you. You have
Yeah,
the
so
last word.
Legitimacy, it is true. I think Iran government has lost legitimacy. We can see this in the decline in the voter participation in the last presidential and parliamentary election that has been the lowest since the 1979, the beginning of the revolution. So that regime has lost support, but the key issue is that when the regime loses support, it doesn't mean that automatically that the opposition gained that support. And until the opposition doesn't present a viable alternative, revolutions or this type of change don't happen. There is a study about protests that happened in Russia in 2011. There was an election and there was alleged fraud and there were protests. And they did surveys afterwards in districts that there were more protests, the vote for the incumbent party, for Putin's party, declined. But the vote of the opposition did not increase. They asked for the questions. So the protest helps to give the information about fraud to the voters. So voters found out about the fraud and didn't vote for the incumbent party next time. But the questions, the survey also showed that the voters didn't have confidence in the opposition. So the votes of the incumbents were lost, but they didn't get to the opposition. It's the same, I think, mistake that I see Iranian opposition also makes over and over. They put a lot of energy on attacking the regime, discrediting the regime. It works, I think. They even don't need to attack. The regime is discrediting itself. But they assume that they would, if they discredit their opponent, they will receive that credit. But if your job is only just like talking bad about the other person, how would this increase like the people's in your ability to govern? I think that's so presenting a viable alternative is something that is missing. It's part of the recipe of a revolution, but it happens during the time. It's also something that we can predict from before.
Brilliant. I don't know whether
Nadereh
has disconnected, but I think she might have. Maybe on her behalf, I can thank you, and I can thank Nadereh for chairing the session. Thank you to you both. Again, I certainly learned a lot, and thank you for all the excellent questions from the participants. Hope to see you at our next webinar soon in June. Thank you very much. Thank you both. And thank you for Mohammed Farzanagan for all the organization behind the scene as well. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.